Critical infrastructure around the world is targeted by 13 cyber attacks every single second, a number that's only growing. This isn't just about data breaches or minor disruptions. These are targeted attacks on systems that power our cities, manage our water supply, and keep our hospitals running. I'm Josh Moulin, principal at Natsar. With over 20 years in the field, from safeguarding the U.S. nuclear weapons enterprise to supporting government and critical industries, I'm here to walk you through the unique challenges of protecting these vital systems. In this presentation, we'll explore the evolving threats to critical infrastructure and the steps that you can take to ensure its resilience. Thanks for watching. Before you dive in, I wanted to share that you can earn continuing education credit for this content. Just visit natsar.com and register for free to access this presentation. Instructions and a link to access it are available below. Upon completion, you'll receive a certificate of attendance, which can be used toward continuing professional education hours. It's our way of giving back to the cybersecurity community. If you find our content helpful, please subscribe to our channel to be notified of future content. Also, feel free to explore our on-demand courses and other valuable cybersecurity resources available at natsar.com. And if you're here to watch without needing a certificate, I hope you enjoy the video. Before we get too far into it, though, I wanted to take a minute to just set the stage of what it is to be critical infrastructure. And when I say the words critical infrastructure, what that actually is referring to. So I want to just give a common lexicon and definition for what it is we're speaking about. First of all, critical infrastructure, sometimes referred to as CI, refers to physical or virtual assets and systems and networks that are vital to the security, economy, public health, and the welfare of a jurisdiction. So these are the most important components of a city, town, county, state, country, or whatever jurisdiction that you might be talking about. In fact, these are so vital that if they were incapacitated or destroyed, it would have a significant impact on things like national security, economic stability, public health, and even safety. There's a number of sectors that fall into critical infrastructure. Now, there is no worldwide global definition for critical infrastructure. The United States has its sectors, other countries have theirs, but there are, in general, major categories that almost everyone agrees on should be considered critical infrastructure. On this slide, I have a couple of examples of what we generally see no matter where you go. And in many cases, countries don't even have a defined or agreed to definition of critical infrastructure, believe it or not, but usually these are the things people think of. So chemical and manufacturing plants and companies that do that kind of work, communications, which would include cell phone providers and internet providers and other forms of communications, your defense industrial base, or those companies that are providing products and services to military and other defense organizations, emergency services, so your police, fire, EMS, and other types of emergency services that would fall under that category. Of course, your energy, your electric companies, your utilities like natural gas and others that are part of the utility and energy subsector. Financial services, so your banks and investments and other firms and companies that do financial services. Food and agriculture, of course. Government services and facilities, so it could be everything from a public works infrastructure to a city hall to a county facility. Of course, healthcare is critical infrastructure anywhere that I've seen. IT, whether it's a data center or the underlying infrastructure. Of course, nuclear, things like nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Water, wastewater, and dams. And then finally, your transportation, your airports, your seaports, your highway system, your rail system, all of those kinds of things would be considered critical infrastructure. So now that we have a little bit of a definition and stage setting done, let's talk about the threat landscape. And it is definitely changing. This is a picture I took of a museum within the Idaho National Lab complex. And this is actually a building where they very first were able to turn nuclear energy into something that could power a light bulb. And they essentially took a snapshot in time of the control room. Even the chalkboard and the notes that somebody had written is still there, just like it was when this happened. The light bulb they powered on is still in the room. So it's a fascinating museum to look at. But this is really what critical infrastructure looked like when a lot of things were being built. And you've got a lot of analog systems. There's certainly no IT systems talking to this. And so you would have to physically be in a control room to control the infrastructure that this was being used for. But that's not what we see today. In fact, today, this is really what control rooms look like for critical infrastructure, and it may not even be in the same physical location as the infrastructure itself. I've been into control rooms for all sorts of different critical infrastructure operations, and very much they look like this. They almost look like a security operations center where there's monitors everywhere, there's people in there 24/7. One of the probably most robust ones I've ever been in was actually a power company that was controlling multiple states from their control room, and it did look very much like this. But everything is IT systems and data centers and fiber optics and a lot of different components here, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the components that are typically found in these enterprises. But the bottom line is, it isn't the analog non-connected systems anymore. It's all interconnected IT and OT operational technology systems that we see. And if you look at the Industrial Revolution on this slide, you could say we're in Industry 4.0 now. And in Industry 4.0, it's all about big data and connectivity and automation, robotics and IoT devices, Internet of Things. And all of these are causing this push for IT, OT convergence, where you have systems that are internet capable on these kinds of critical infrastructure networks, and we're going to talk about some of the risks associated with that. But this really is what we are seeing when we look at these organizations, particularly in the private sector, where this is their business. This is where they make their money. They're being pushed to do more automation and more robotics. And so lots of technology is being baked into these organizations. These are common challenges seen in critical infrastructure. Now, these could be said for almost any organization, not just CI, but we definitely see these almost exacerbated in critical infrastructure because they are somewhat of a niche. So even your traditional cybersecurity professionals may not have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be effective in critical infrastructure environments because of the operational technology, industrial control systems, SCADA, etc., types of protocols and communications and connectivity that you just don't learn in traditional cybersecurity or even traditional IT. So number one, we see that skills gap, where already it's hard to find skilled cybersecurity talent across the world, but in particular, critical infrastructure really struggles with this because of those things I was mentioning, where it is such a niche. Number two, expanding attack surface. We see the attack surface quickly expanding everywhere, not just in critical infrastructure, but if you remember the slide I had with Industry 4.0, that attack surface is going from a control room. Even if it was connected internally, it might be in a data center with a firewall and your traditional castle and moat scenario where everything was confined to a particular location. That's not the case anymore. Now we have cloud security concepts that we have to be aware of. We have convergence of networks. We have VPN, virtual private networks, coming into some of these environments. We have mobility and software as a service, number three, where there's so many different as a service offerings that these places are taking advantage of. Everything from their productivity suite like Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace to all the different various tools that they may be using from vendors that offer a cloud offering. And so now you've got different people, organizations, communications coming in to touch the components of critical infrastructure. And then you have a supply chain issue to deal with. Not only do you have things to worry about like the Microsoft and SolarWinds compromises that were part of a supply chain attack, and we do know there's been multiple breaches in the last year plus where source code of critical companies have been disclosed to attackers, and so we're certainly on the lookout for more attacks like this. But we also have to worry about the components of the supply chain. Are critical infrastructure like the power grid or wastewater treatment plants or drinking water organizations buying switches, routers, firewalls, other technology that are counterfeit? Maybe they're not reliable, or worst case scenario, they're actually implanted with a backdoor that allows an adversary to get unfettered access to the network. So there's a lot of supply chain issues to be aware of. And then finally, number 5, sophisticated adversaries. We certainly have to worry about the script kiddies that are just trying to get into whatever they can get into, but that's not what I'm talking about in this presentation. We're talking about state-sponsored, in some cases, military organizations, sophisticated adversaries that know what they're targeting, and they are intentionally going after critical infrastructure, whether it's in the United States or other countries, to debilitate a location. And these adversaries are, in fact, sophisticated, and we'll talk in a little bit about some of the malware that's being developed just for critical infrastructure environments. These are common adversaries that critical infrastructure, and frankly, anybody, face from a cyber defense perspective. First is your cyber criminals. Those are your typical people that are using technology to facilitate and commit their crimes. Could be for financial gain, for espionage, for any other reason. They're just criminals that are using cyber to facilitate what they're doing. State actors, these are your actors that are funded and resourced and trained in many cases by foreign governments, and they are going after their targets for whatever political or other intelligence, whatever reason they have. We have hacktivists. These are individuals or groups that hack and attack organizations or individuals based on some sort of perceived injustice or something else they're focused on, and that's why they're motivated to do what they're doing. You have insider threats, whether it's people that are on the inside intentionally doing something that creates a risk of vulnerability or breach of information, or somebody who's on the inside that's just making very poor decisions that unintentionally are creating these kinds of risks for an organization. And then you have those opportunistic attackers that they're like the burglars that walk down a neighborhood in the middle of the night, rattling doors, and when they find a house that's unlocked, they go in to burglarize it. That house was not their target. However, they found one unlocked, so it was a crime of opportunity. And we see this all the time with cybersecurity as well. People just scanning the internet, looking for vulnerabilities, using tools like Shodan and others that already show vulnerabilities that exist on the internet, and then trying to exploit those. Now let's look at this slide for just a minute. 87% of organizations say they know they've suffered a cybersecurity incident in the past 18 months. That's a pretty remarkable number, that 87% of the people surveyed said, we know for sure we've had a cybersecurity incident in the last year and a half. That's a pretty startling high number. Of those 87%, though, 65% of them said not only did we have a cyber attack in the last 18 months, but it was so bad that we either had a breach, we had some data spillage out of our organization, and or we had systems that were crippled, they were incapacitated. Whether it was from a denial of service attack or ransomware or some other cause, they were completely out of business for some time. In some cases, these companies were never able to get back into business. So we see the complexity and severity of cyber attacks continuing to increase, and that is certainly true with critical infrastructure organizations. As a brief review for some of you may not be familiar with this. This is the cyber attack kill chain. Our goal as cyber defenders is to stop this as far left as possible. So I'll just quickly go through the different steps that adversaries take in order to compromise a network. And this is true for IT or OT or any other type of network. So first, they do reconnaissance, and that could be doing open source intelligence on a target, on a company, finding out domain information, seeing what vulnerabilities exist, anything they can do to do recon on the person or organization that they are targeting. Once they've done that and they've selected how they are going to attack, then they create their weaponized attack medium. So this could be a phishing email with a link that takes you to a website that's been compromised that will do a drive-by attack. It could be a phishing email that has an attachment in it that's got malicious code that you may click and run. It could be a number of different things. It could be that they've discovered a vulnerability that's exploitable and they launch an attack against it. And that takes us to the next step, deliver. They have to deliver their weaponized attack against you somehow. Generally, over 90%, we see this as being phishing or spear phishing emails, but it doesn't have to be. Then they exploit the system. Then they generally install. This one doesn't always have to happen. There is malware that exists that is only in RAM, that random access memory of a system, so it's non-persistent, meaning when you reboot, that malware is gone. But because people so infrequently reboot, that is something that can live for a very long time these days. It's not like the old days where we would reboot or even turn off systems when we went home. And then they moved to command and control, or C2 or CNC. This is where they are sending commands to that system that they've exploited and able to tell it to do something else or to send data to them. And finally is that action to objective. This is them doing what they set out to do. It could be just sitting and advertising for sale access to a network, like a remote access broker. This is something we're seeing a lot more of. It could be that they now deploy ransomware, or they steal information to exploit you, or they just wait and see what else they can find on the inside of your network to get more sprawl across the network and just sit there until they have whatever they're looking for, or they've gotten into sufficient space on the network that they feel pretty comfortable you won't be able to get them out quickly. Cyber attacks against critical infrastructure are increasing. I mentioned that the complexity and severity of attacks are increasing, and so are just the numbers of attacks against critical infrastructure. In fact, in 2023, we saw across the world, critical infrastructure experienced 13 cyber attacks every single second. 13 attacks per second against critical infrastructure globally, and this is up 30% from 2022 alone. The other thing to keep in mind is critical infrastructure attacks are in fact life-threatening. Gartner gave a prediction that by 2025, attackers will have weaponized a critical infrastructure cyber physical system to successfully harm or kill humans. Now, those cyber physical components is that IT, information technology, and OT, operational technology convergence. And that's where you have things that are controlled or communicated with via the internet that control some physical device. It could be raising the floodgates of a dam. It could be releasing chemicals into water treatment. It could be turning on or off parts of the power grid, or it could be controlling an elevator or an escalator. There's lots and lots of examples. But imagine if you could control things like that. And we've seen attacks like that where chemicals were dumped into a water treatment facility or the power was turned off. In fact, I'm going to show you in just a little bit some of the more notable attacks against critical infrastructure that we know about. Another thing is critical infrastructure attacks are profitable for the adversaries. And we see at the bottom here, ransomware attackers received $1.1 billion US dollars in 2023 alone. They know that if they take down critical infrastructure organizations, they are more likely to get paid, because critical infrastructure can't just say, well, we'll be down for a couple weeks until we figure this out, or we'll try and decrypt what was encrypted, or we're going to work with law enforcement and see if they can find our information or get this figured out. They don't have time for that. Hospitals don't, power grids don't, things like natural gas pipelines don't have time for that. And the adversaries know that. They also know that most of these places will have cyber insurance, which may or may not lead to faster and more robust payouts of ransomware payments. And they know that these organizations don't necessarily want to publicize that they've been breached. So they may also just want to get it over with quickly, pay a ransom, and get back in business. So the attackers know that this is a prime target for cyber attacks. The attack of choice has definitely been ransomware, and I'll show you a couple of those. In fact, here's a few examples right here. Attackers of the recent United Healthcare attack, which we're going to talk more about, they received 22 million US dollars in response to their ransomware attack. The Colonial Pipeline attack received 5 million. The meat packer plant, if you remember JBS meat packer plant in the United States, they paid their attackers 11 million. And according to Sophos, the average ransomware payment just globally was $2 million. So if you think about just the average payment being $2 million across the world, these attackers are making a lot of money. Now here's some specific malware that's been developed for critical infrastructure and OT type environments. The first one, the Indestroyer 2, impacts field controllers and other ICS, industrial control systems. And this is designed to impact specifically high voltage electrical substations. Now, we saw this being used in Ukraine, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. We've also seen Black Energy 3 used, and we'll talk about that also. But this is a Trojan generally delivered in phishing campaigns that's designed to work with plugins for SCADA, those supervisory control and data acquisition systems. Then we've got the Triton, or sometimes called Tri-Sys malware. This can just stop running programs that use the Tri-Station protocol. This has been called the world's most murderous malware. The most notable attack has been against the petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. And then finally, Pipedream. This one has a lot of capabilities. It can manipulate a lot of industrial control programmable logic controllers, those PLCs that tie between physical and cyber, and also industrial software. Now let's talk about some notable attacks against critical infrastructure. First is United Healthcare. This is probably, if you're watching this in 2024, notable and in recent memory for most of us, but this is a ransomware attack against one of the largest health payment processing companies in the world. This was so effective that it created a backlog of unpaid medical claims, so much so that 94% of doctors and hospitals in the US had such serious cash flow problems that they actually had to stop operations in many cases. It also disrupted pharmacies. We started seeing surgeries getting delayed, medical practices stopped seeing patients, pharmacies that could not fill orders for medications. So obviously a life safety implication here. Not only did we have that, but we had 150 million patient records compromised by the attackers. United Health paid a ransom of $22 million to the attackers on this, and Black Cat is who compromised United Health with stolen credentials. So this means that credentials for United Health were found somewhere. Those credentials were still active. The attackers were able to use those credentials to log into something in United Healthcare, and unfortunately, there was no multi-factor authentication. And this is where you get, at least I do in this, doing this for so long, it's just frustrating to see, in many cases, such simple, basic cyber hygiene things that could have been implemented to prevent something like this. Something like multi-factor authentication. And I'm sure there's a number of other mitigations that could have been used. And we see this just time and time again. Number two, the Ukraine power grid. I said that we would be talking about this. So this is a 2015 cyber attack that resulted in outages for more than 200,000 customers. This is where that Black Energy 3 malware was used by an attacker that goes by Sandworm. First, they actually infiltrated corporate networks, and then they moved to the operational technology network from there. And they did this from a phishing attack. They deleted a bunch of files using kill disk. Then they started doing another attack while this was going on. That was a denial of service, or DOS attack. And they not only did the primary power grid, but they also were able to disable all of the emergency backup generators. So this was a significant and life-threatening event for those in Ukraine. And we see this question of, well, why was a phishing attack able to compromise the OT, operational technology network? Why was there a bridge between those two? And that's an excellent question, and something we're going to see as a repeating theme throughout the presentation. Number three, the Saudi Arabia plant. This is an interesting one for a number of reasons, but one is that the attackers actually gained access to this network in 2014, but they were not discovered until 2017. So we talk about the dwell time of an adversary inside of a network, and on average it fluctuates a little bit, but oftentimes it's about a year before somebody realizes that they're compromised. And a lot of damage can obviously be done in a year. In this situation, that dwell time was 3 years that those adversaries sat in this network. They used that Triton malware that I mentioned a little bit ago. They made access again through the IT network, and then were able to navigate to the OT network because there was connectivity. They targeted controllers made by Schneider Electric, and this could have been catastrophic. It was designed to release toxic gases and create explosions. But luckily, there was a flaw in their malware, and that flaw triggered a safety system alert, which drew the attention of the employees to something wrong. They didn't know what it was initially, but they were able to stop the explosions and the gas release. And this was the first ever malware found that was intentionally developed solely to kill people. And this is why I mentioned earlier the name of the most dangerous malware was because of this reason. That's the whole reason it was developed, was just to hurt and kill people. And then number four, Colonial Pipeline. This is something also near and dear to many of our hearts in the United States. We all probably remember this. This was a 2021 attack that targeted a U.S. oil pipeline company that supplied 45% of the East Coast's gas, diesel, and jet fuel. In fact, 11,000 gas stations just ran out of fuel because they weren't able to be resupplied. The attackers, known as the Dark Side, stole more than 100 gigabytes of data in this attack, in addition to the ransomware attack that shut them down. The company ended up paying $5 million. And based on this attack, we saw gas prices in the US rise the highest ever or at least the highest in the last 6 years they had been. So this impacted just Americans generally because of the price of gas, because of this cyber attack. Now, once again, it was one of those attacks that just shouldn't have happened. They had a VPN that had a username and password, and that username and password had been compromised in another attack. These attackers found those compromised credentials. So just like United Healthcare, valid, legitimate credentials were found and used in the attack. And again, because there was no multi-factor authentication or a number of other safety checks, they were able to gain remote access to this network and compromise it with their ransomware. There are a number of risks specific to critical infrastructure, and some of these, though, really go for any IT network as well. But first, we definitely see a lot of just a lack of network visibility, especially within OT environments. And I have been to a number of critical infrastructure organizations and done risk assessments and cyber assessments, and they almost universally, unless they're a really major company or have some other capabilities, because they're tied in with something else, most of them do not have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week SOC, Security Operations Center, or anything else looking at the traffic going in and out of their OT environments. There's also generally a large number of unmitigated vulnerabilities. If you scan these, if you even can scan for vulnerabilities, but depending on how fragile and old their networks are, you will find many unmitigated vulnerabilities, most of which have known exploits and have been sitting around for years and years, just unpatched because they don't have either the knowledge or the staff to do anything about it. There's also little or no asset control. Like the saying goes, you cannot protect what you don't know exists. That's absolutely true. And especially in IT and OT networks, you have to know what's out there, what you should expect on the network, who should be talking to who, and those kinds of things in order. If you don't know what normal looks like, you can't really see something that's abnormal. So you have to know that, just that baseline. They have no formalized incident response plans. This is typical. If something happens, they're building the airplane as they fly. They have no idea who to call, what to do. There's no retainers in place, and they're just really caught off guard, and that's a bad place to be in some sort of a cyber incident. Oftentimes we see network convergence without segmentation. I can't tell you the number of times I've worked with a city or a county or even a state that they say, well, we've got our water system tied into our city network so our public works people can log in from home if there's something going on and check something out. And there might be a VPN into the city, but no multi-factor authentication on that, really no monitoring or security, and there's nothing between the city network and this SCADA system that they've now connected. So it's just sitting on the city network, no segmentation whatsoever. That's super common. Again, that balance of convenience versus security. Generally, convenience wins, and you get something like that. There's default credentials, admin, password, or they share credentials across all the different devices because they don't want to have to manage a bunch of passwords. Again, no Security Operations Center. We see internet connectivity within high-risk environments. So all those case studies I showed you already where something started as a phishing email and now next thing you know it's in a Schneider logic controller or something like that because there was some connectivity. We have unsecure remote access like those VPNs or other remote access with no multi-factor authentication, no monitoring. Credentials aren't turned off right away when they're not used, they're not being changed, etc. There's also no baseline configuration controls. So they don't have something like the CIS benchmarks or the DISA STIGs or something like that that says this is how every system should be set up, and we're going to harden our systems and we'll make sure that if there's any deviation, we know about it, but also we're making it less likely that these systems will be compromised. They often have legacy or unsupported software and hardware. I can't tell you the number of times I've gone into these organizations and they're still running Windows XP on systems and it's still connected to the network. And they just don't, it's because that computer is tied to some machine that they've spent hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on, and they're not going to upgrade it anytime soon. Now, there's ways to get around that and protect it, but they don't often do those things. And then just generally a lack of what we call basic cyber hygiene, those basic things like the CIS controls, implementation group 1, those things that any organization should be doing, regardless of the level of risk, just aren't being done on many of these places. Now, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. First, cybersecurity is a national security issue. And if you're doing cybersecurity and cyber defense, you are on the front lines of this national security issue. In fact, I used AI to create this image because I was trying to get across this reality that people are facing in cybersecurity. So here, if you think about, let's say in the United States, if a city or county was being invaded by a foreign military that was adversarial, of course, to the United States, and we told the local police department, hey, we got this army coming in, they've got fighter jets and attack helicopters and tanks and this massive ground force, and we need you to send out your patrol officers to deal with this. I mean, that would just be ridiculous. They're not trained for that, they're not equipped for that, etc. And they'd certainly be outgunned and outnumbered. But this is exactly what we're doing on the cyber front. We are telling our cyber defenders, you're going up every day against all these adversarial nations and all these advanced adversaries, and you may not even have a full cyber team. It could be a collateral duty where you're an IT person and you're doing a little bit of security on the side, but you have no formal training, none of that. And that is exactly what's happening in so many places. So we're already a little bit outgunned and outnumbered on many things when it comes to cybersecurity and especially critical infrastructure. And this is one of those things I like to talk to executives about when I brief boards and other people about just the position that many of our cyber defenders are up against and the things that they're having to do. So what can you do as a cybersecurity professional working in critical infrastructure or really any type of IT environment? Here's a couple tips that I have come up with just over my years of helping people and seeing things and doing it myself that I found to be just good things to think through. So the first is raise the cybersecurity awareness and maturity of your organization. And I'm not talking about the yearly check the box cybersecurity training, but the more you can do to train your users about good cyber hygiene, about who to talk to if they have a question. And of course, all the things we teach, don't click on links and be wary of this or that, is good. But even the old phishing emails, and by old, maybe just a year ago, where we would teach people look for grammatical errors and spelling errors and formatting issues, all that's pretty much gone now with things like generative AI. Somebody can create a very well-written, believable phishing email in about 30 seconds and have that sent right over. So we have to up our game with cyber awareness and make sure people understand the risks, but also in a way that is meaningful to them. Also, be agile. Try things, see if they work, and make adjustments. If they don't work, that's okay. Then adjust and move on. But don't get so mired down into process sometimes. Obviously, we have to do things safe and secure, and we can't put our information or our companies or organizations at risk. But there's lots of things we can try, even if it's, let's try a new alert on the SIM and see if that works. Oh, it's too noisy. Great, let's tweak it. But now we're doing something and we're trying to make things a little bit better. Along those lines, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And by that, I mean an 80% solution today is better than a 100% solution next year. And I see this all the time where people are saying, oh, I'd really like to be able to do asset inventory, but it's going to take me 2 or 3 years to be able to afford an automated system to go through and tell me all the hardware and software in my environment. Great. You don't want to wait 2 to 3 years for that. This is why in the CIS controls, the first couple ones are know your hardware, know your software. It's that important. Use Nmap and a Microsoft Excel or Google Sheet to at least get started. And look at your switches and your routers and MAC addresses and IP addresses and try and figure out what all is even on your network now. And of that, Who's it assigned to? What's a computer name? Is it even supposed to be on your network? And at least you're starting somewhere. And I've done this myself, and it's amazing the things that you find when you just start doing things like that. And then someday maybe you will get an automated tool, and maybe you won't, but at least you've started and you're doing something. Along those lines too, do something. You cannot steer a parked car. And I see a lot of times in cybersecurity, people just suffer from this analysis paralysis. There's so much noise and so many recommendations and so much information that people just freeze. And in the meantime, adversaries are doing things and users are doing things, and nothing is getting done from a cyber perspective. So make sure you're doing something. It may not be your ultimate goal, may not be perfect, but it is something that you're moving forward on. Also, just stay up to date on what's going on. Most cyber professionals, this is as much of a passion as it is a career, so people do that. But it is important to know what is going on. What are the new tactics and techniques and procedures that we see? What are other people falling victim to that you might think, oh boy, glad that didn't happen to me because I would have had an issue with that. Let's go look at how we can fix that to not be the next person that's attacked that way. Also, just remember the basics. It's so easy to get enamored by AI and ML and all the vendor speak, and also just the next bright and shiny object. Remember that basic blocking and tackling is still critically important in cybersecurity. Use some sort of framework to assess yourself, whether it's the CIS controls or the NIST CSF or the CISA CPGs. In cyber, we've got a lot of acronyms too. But use something, pick something, and just assess yourself. How do I do in this? How do I do in this? This is clearly a gap for us. Let's put a plan together to eventually get there and see what we can do today to make us a little bit better. Also with cybersecurity, I see a lot of professionals lacking in knowing business and communications. So you may be an excellent cybersecurity person, but you can't communicate things effectively to your boss. And so you're losing out on money, on help, on whatever it might be. Make sure that you understand what's most important to your boss and to your organization. What are their mission critical priorities, how you tie into that, and also learn a little bit how to speak to business people, and how do you take really complex technical topics and distill them down to people who are not cybersecurity experts, but they need to know the information to make decisions. And then finally, make sure you take care of yourself. Cybersecurity is fast-paced, it's very stressful. We're actually seeing some statistics now that cybersecurity professionals are ranking high on the stress, most stressful careers, up with surgeons and police officers and firefighters and things like that. So make sure you take care of yourself. I know it can be easy to think, well, if I take this week off, who knows what's going to happen to the network? But you just can't do that to yourself, because you're not effective if you're burned out and you're not paying attention because you're just overloaded. So do make sure that you take care of yourself as well, for your own health and for the health of your organization. A few other mindset things I just want to go over. First is this saying of prevention is ideal, but detection is a must. What I mean by that is it's great to do prevention. We have to do it. Things like firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention systems and endpoint detection and response and all of that. Now there's a lot of bleeding between prevention and detection, but don't just put all your eggs in the prevention basket. We have to be able to detect those adversaries as quickly as possible. Remember that cyber kill chain. We want to get them as far left as possible. We don't want them dwelling in our network for 1 or 3 or however many years. We need those tripwires to be flagged when somebody does something on our network. So prevention is ideal, but detection is an absolute must. Another thing to keep in mind, assume the adversary is already inside your network. And this is a little bit like zero trust networking architecture, those concepts. Zero trust is a really bad wording. We have to trust people at some point. So it's more like zero trust or zero implicit trust. But when you go to design things or monitor for things, just assume the adversary is already on the inside of your network. And how could you do things differently, or what could you go look at, almost like a threat hunt perspective, to see, would you be able to catch them if somebody was in your network? And then I'll leave you with this last one, and I use this a lot with executives on just your mindset from a cybersecurity perspective, because I see a lot of organizations that equate their budget with how secure they are. And that is a very dangerous position to be in, especially if you're a CISO or you lead the IT or cybersecurity business unit within your organization. So the question should not be, are we safe? The answer to that question pretty much is no. Anybody can be attacked at any time. And if you have a well-resourced adversary that's specifically targeting you, they're probably going to find a way in. So we want to stop asking, are we safe? Instead, the mindset and the question we want our executives to be asking is this: are we prepared? So it's the not if, but when. Do we know what we're going to do? Do we have an incident response plan? Have we done tabletop exercises to practice that plan? So we're not asking, are we safe? We're asking, are we prepared? That is the mindset that you want your executives and even yourselves to be in when you're thinking through your cybersecurity program. And that's it for this presentation. I hope you found it valuable. If there's anything that I or my company can do, please feel free to reach out with the contact information on here. And as I mentioned, if you didn't start getting continuing education, but now you would like to, you can go to natsar.com. There's a link below to watch this video and get a certificate for your continuing education hours. And I'd also invite you to check out our other cybersecurity resources. Thank you very much.